start with the question that I've been asking everybody when I'm doing this is, your name, your title, and then how did you get this job on Attack of the Show?
Sure.
And so that is my first question.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wong. I was a segment producer / on-air talent for Attack of the Show on the Asian Underground segment. How I got this job? Well, a friend of mine named Corrado Corretto, who was field producer extraordinaire, contacted me about this crazy idea he had where he wanted to review lesser known Asian cinema on Attack of the Show. He sent me this email saying, like, what did I think and how would I go about it? And I sent him a long email reply saying, like, oh, this is what I think would work. This is what I think to stay away from. And if you kind of broke it up this way, it'd be really good. Good luck with the segment. I hope it all works out for you. Then he emails me back and says, actually, the whole point of this is I want you to be on the segment, to which I quickly replied, you're crazy. No one's going to put me on TV. And then he, in all his powers of convincing, convinced me to try it. So we did a test shoot, and then we kept doing more for, I think, in a period of over 3 or 4 years, where we just would randomly shoot these things from time to time, and it just kept growing and growing. And that's kind of how it all began.
Just with an email from Corrado.
Yeah, basically.
Could you explain, like, okay, Corrado is a character. He is. What's that video game character they would always have him dress up as? Is it Kratos?
The Kratos God of War. Yeah.
Kratos God of War. Yeah. He would always, because he has that body. He has bulk. He's typical of a lot of dudes with that kind of body. He skips leg day. Yeah. But yeah, no, Corrado's a real character. Can you talk a little bit about, like, how you knew him and, like, what Corrado's like?
So Corrado and I actually met back. We worked in the tape vault at Fox Studios, and how this all came about was we would spend our days getting tapes for producers, but also then talking about anime and Asian cinema. He's a very longtime anime fan, and we had that connection. We both left Fox and went our separate ways, and then I got an email from him about this very specific topic, because he remembered that I had sort of this, like all nerds, this encyclopedic knowledge of anime and Asian cinema. And he is a larger than life dude who can basically sell anything. So I'm a very shy person. I'm very introverted, but with his sort of encouragement and coaching, he kind of brought me out to be able to do this, to be able to speak, and on camera about the things that I love. And it was like through his larger than life persona that he was able to, like, get me to do this stuff.
And what was your first appearance on the show like? Do you have a recollection of the first time you were?
I remember that shoot very vividly.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, so I think our first test shoot, we ended up doing, I think we went to Chinatown in LA at nighttime, and we wanted to get, like, different parts of the area on camera. So I, never having done anything like this before, was, like, completely nervous and, like, not sure how it was all going to work. Did we need permits? All these things running through my head. And I remember, like, that first moment where I had to answer a question from Chris, I was just, like, frozen. And then we all stopped down, and then I think Corrado said, like, jump up and down. And then Chris had some pointers too. And it was like, I had never been on camera before. So Chris was like, here, use my makeup, which was like a whole different experience. And quite mind-blowing thing to me. It was that, oh, I have to wear makeup. Okay, so these are the things that are now going to be part of my life. And there we were, kind of just shooting in Chinatown to get that first segment. At the beginning of Asian Underground, we would travel a lot, and I think that was becoming a little unwieldy. But if you look at those early segments, we're like in an arcade, in Chinatown, like, and then we found our home at Spin Fusion, which then became our home for the rest of the life of the segment.
I remember that shoot in Chinatown. I remember that day. The jumping up and down thing is just a way to kind of loosen up. The makeup is just, I don't know. They give you a makeup kit.
Yeah.
In the field, you have to like, this is the thing that you got to wear this makeup so you're not shiny.
Yeah, no, the anti-shine was a thing that I had no idea existed until doing this. And no, it was great because you guys had been doing it for a while. So it was like, you kind of helped me through the sort of the growing pains and the learning curve of it. But yeah, it was, I still remember like driving out there and being like terrified. I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this is never going to work. And then, after the segment was cut together and then it aired, it was like, okay, we're going to keep going. So, get some more movies together. And then my life became like, oh, I got to find like 6 new movies to watch, which was great because it was what I was doing anyways, but it was still like, oh, now there's an added element to it.
Because I think that there were like 4 movies. You would tell me about 4 films, and we try to shoot like 3 or 4 segments each shoot, and then they were banked.
Yeah. So what we did was I would watch 4, and then we would pick 3, but we would try to shoot 2 or 3 segments per shoot. So we were shooting 4 to 6 hours. We would try to get it done in 4, and that's usually how we would get two episodes out of each shoot. So it was like you and I had to bring, this is sort of an insider secret, or maybe not, but we would bring different clothes and like pretend like it's a different day. And sometimes we would go from day to night. So the lighting would change, and that would indicate a passage of time. But I think, by the 5th or 6th one, we had it locked down. I think there was one where we didn't even have a field producer because they couldn't, for whatever reason, they were tied up. And you and I just shot it ourselves, and we were fine because we had been doing it so long at that point that I think it all worked. And, it's one of those things where it's with enough repetitions, you get better at it. But because, the movies change and accessibility of the movies change, like there was always kind of something new happening within the industry. And also like we tried to be really good about curating the topics, or at least I was being mindful of like what we could do, because we also had that overlap where we couldn't run stuff if DVD Tuesday was running stuff, which I remember became an issue on some topics that I wanted to do, but we always managed to find a way to work around it.
Yeah, there wasn't that much crossover, if I recall, but I do remember like really pushing the limits on the titles that you chose. Were like you were looking for stuff that was like definitely edgy.
Yeah, I think I had the one particular time was I had a whole like director's series about it was basically Asian directors doing Westerns. And I had this like it was my baby. I was going to do this thing with Sukiyaki Western Django, Good, Bad, and the Weird, and I forget the other name, Paper Tiger, I think, or Tears of the Black Tiger. And I was ready to go. I had the whole segment prepared, and then they're like, "Oh, we're doing Sukiyaki on DVD Tuesday," and it's not like I could easily find another Western directed by an Asian director, so it kind of blew up. It blew up the whole segment. So I think that's kind of the moment I remember. Oh yeah, there is another DVD segment on this show that we kind of have to keep an eye on.
But I think that's what made it cool. Like I wasn't really burdened with having to have all the movie knowledge because no human could possibly do that. I do happen to know a lot of crazy and weird and obscure films and filmmakers, but you had like, and I knew of a lot of the stuff that you were picking, but I always felt like I learned something. Is there something that you did on Asian Underground where you feel like that's the one you're proud of? Like, I introduced to the Attack of the Show audience this filmmaker or movie.
I think when we got into sort of the Tokyo Gore Police era of kind of exploitation Japanese films, that was the one that it was just kind of scratching the surface, and a handful of people knew about it, but it was so mind-blowing visually for people to kind of take in that I thought that was one that I was particularly happy that we got to do that. You never know how people are going to respond to sort of the the subject matter in the films, and with something that's as, exploitation heavy as those films, it was like, well, they're either going to love it or they're going to be grossed out. And luckily, a lot of people loved it. And those movies, have their merit. They're obviously not the greatest films in the world, but I think for what we were doing, it kind of represented what we were going for and what we wanted to share with people. Is like, there's going to be mainstream stuff like, Jackie Chan movies, and those things have been distributed in the US forever. But these kind of like really rough, gritty films that they kind of gutted out through that era. It was really cool that it was distributed out here, and then we got to share it with people.
That first of all, I think you should be really proud that you introduced Tokyo Gore Police. I was fortunate. I saw that at Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. So I'm really proud of myself whenever I feel like I knew of like what you were going to present. Corrado, to go back to Corrado for a sec, I don't know if you remember, because I work with him quite a bit as a field producer, and it was like, the biggest thing was, it was like he approached segments that he did for Attack of the Show like he was making a movie, and his directing approach was like Kubrick, because it was like, I want to get 30 hours of B-roll.
I remember we shot B-roll almost every time we were there, and I remember thinking one time, like, it is Spin Fusion, and we come here every time. But, by all means, go ahead and shoot these shelves one more time. So, yeah. And then there was like several times when you're like, what we're filming is a conversation. It's kind of like what we're having now. And but you flub over words. You kind of lose your train of thought just because of something happens. I remember if we had, what was his name? Josh, the sound guy. He had a knack for making me laugh, like just by little things he would do. And it was, whenever he was on the set, I knew we were going to have a lot of fun, but I also knew that like, oh, it's going to be a long shoot because I'm not going to be able to hold it together half the time. So I think that was kind of the fun of that, even though it was, we got it down to one location, and it was a small crew, but it was always like a really fun, easygoing shoot. Like, all of my sort of, work and anxiety and stress took place beforehand, just prepping the whole thing. But then when we got on the day, it was always pretty easy, and it was always a good time working with that crew.
As you began to do segments and they began to air, were people recognizing you on the street? Were you getting like, hey, I saw you, you're the Asian Underground guy? Yeah,
that actually happened a handful of times. I think one of the most surprising ones was I was in New York City, and I had dipped into like a comic book store in downtown, and I was just like checking it out. And then the guy was like, oh, I recognize you from somewhere. And in my head, I'm like, oh, he thinks I'm someone from here. And I'm like, oh, I'm just visiting. I'm from LA. And then he was like, oh, no, wait, you're on G4 with Chris Gore, right? And then I was like, oh, and my brain didn't know how to process that, but I was being as nice as I could, and he was very kind, and he was very appreciative of the show, and he was a big fan of the segment. And then coincidentally, my local comic book store guy at a few years back when I started going there recognized me from the show as well. So we have a very dedicated audience within the comic book store population.
That's so true. Yeah, like that's what made it fun. Here's the worst thing though about that is I go to a comic book store like that and I'll get recognized or someone will say something and then it ends up just being like doing the show there live.
Yeah.
Like talking about and hearing what movies they love or what comic books they're into, and then like sharing. That's what made it so natural. I think doing that segment with you was that we would be having this conversation if there weren't cameras.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of times where, like, when I sent you the material and then you reviewed it and we got to the day of the shoot, we would just be having a conversation about it beforehand while we're setting up and getting ready. And it was like, that was exactly what we were going to do anyway. So I felt like, and I think Corrado was even like, save it for the, for the camera, because you were so excited about the, whatever movie I found. If you were really into it, all you wanted to do was talk about it right when we got there. And then it's my natural inclination to do that too. So we would just launch into those conversations right from the beginning. Getting back to the comic book thing, or, fans, what I found interesting was, like, if I went to Comic-Con, I would, like, walk around and maybe get recognized here and there. But I think one of the funniest things is if I met up with you and I was standing next to you, as long as we were just side by side, then people instantly got that picture. So I think by virtue of just our framing, I was more recognizable in that sense than, like, just if I'm walking around by myself, I was able to hide a little bit more.
That's hilarious, but that's true. What I want to talk about the sort of cultural impact of Attack of the Show, but before I ask you that, did you interact with, I know I interacted with you, but did you interact with any of the other hosts or other people outside of myself and Corrado and Josh and whatnot?
Not really. I came in a couple times to visit, like, edits and stuff like that. And I met Kevin and I actually knew Olivia from when she was at Fox, because she was there for a while. So we worked in the same building. But as far as interacting with the hosts, I was kind of on my own island. Like, Asian Underground was its own thing. I didn't necessarily have to be in the audiences. And because the nature of sort of, we made these segments in advance so that they could use them where it was necessary, you and I didn't have to be part of sort of the day-to-day just for Asian Underground, because we kind of lived on our own. And I actually, because I had a full-time job outside of this, it was kind of the perfect setup for me. But anytime I went into the office, it did seem like a very lively environment.
It's so weird. I think the experience is like sitting at the little kids table. Yeah. There's you're just going to be off in the other room. The little kids, that's the sort of the people that were not the main hosts. We're off on that little table, little kids table. But I think try to put yourself back into that period of time, that 2005 to 2012. The network launched in 2002, and nerd culture was not cool. It was still, what do you have, these comic books? Wait, you're an adult that collects action figures. Why are you driving, miles? Why are you driving to all these other cities to check out a movie that's only playing in one theater? Like the kinds of things that nerds do. What are you doing going to a comic convention this weekend? You're not doing normal things like going to brunch. Like I feel like there was that time before G4 where nerd culture was this thing where you could still face, you're still ostracized and you're still considered a weirdo. Not that that's also still not the case, but for me. And then I feel that in the time that G4 existed, that the tide began to turn and geek culture, nerd culture began to really blow up into like, oh, this is like a market. People are digging this, and there's a culture that surrounded the show. Can you offer some historical perspective about the world before G4 and kind of after? And then, like, did you feel those things kind of change?
Yeah, I think, separate from what we did in our segment, there was just so little access to these things. And I think as, obviously comic book movies becoming sort of the dominant part of pop culture, when something is successful, I think everyone's going to look to like replicate that, for better or worse. And I think what happens is when you have something like Attack of the Show talking about these topics, and then those topics are also, some of the most successful things going on in movies and TV, then it's just going to grow from there. I think prior to that, if you were into those things, you had to go searching for it. And what we tried to do, or what I tried to do with the segment, and what the show tried to do in general, was kind of like introduce this stuff to everybody, and you expose people to these things. Maybe they like it, maybe they don't, and that's okay. But I think as the exposure grew, and then more and more people got on board with it, and then you have this like boom of comic book movies, and also sneakily the video game industry is becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry. Alongside of it all, there isn't a lot of places that specialized in this kind of content. There are a handful of magazines maybe, and then as sort of it coincided with the internet kind of growing as it did, and you have more and more opportunities for sort of nerd culture related content. So G4 was a TV network, and we had a TV show that talked about all this and that tried to encapsulate this. Now those very same things are all over the internet and kind of has its roots in what G4 did, but you just have such a larger platform now that I think that it's all kind of goes back to that. With XPlay and Attack, you have segments that are people have their own personal YouTube channels that are kind of set up in a very similar way, dedicated, and they have a lot of viewers. So as this content market has gotten more niche, it's been a lot better for the exposure of all these kind of pop culture, nerd culture elements that we grew up with, kind of, whether we were chastised for it or not, it was kind of the stuff we looked for, and now it's readily available to anyone.
I want to talk about what you would consider kind of your best moment or worst moment. I experienced one of my worst moments with you.
And I think I know what you're talking about.
You were there.
Yeah.
It's when I tried to do a high kick and failed miserably. Can you tell me that story? And then I want to hear from your end, because I was on the ground. Yeah.
So if you go back and watch the segments, you'll know that Chris had to do an intro to the piece, and then what he would usually do is talk for a couple seconds, say where we are, what we were doing, and then kick off the segment. So this one particular one, he decided to do a walk and talk plus a high kick. And from my perspective, I just saw him for a second, and then he wasn't there. And then my brain took a second to recognize that he had just completely wiped out. And then the best part about that whole moment is that the camera stayed on, and Chris was kind of rolling on the ground saying, "My pants are too tight." And I thought the whole store, including the guy that worked there, just could not stop laughing. And I believe that that clip is probably more memorable than the entire segment we did on its own.
I remember I said, "I'll buy jeans," because I couldn't say I didn't want to swear or use an expletive.
Yeah, that's right.
I thought, well, I'm on camera and I'm sort of like trained to don't say anything you can't say on television. But I had like my phone and the mic pack in my back pocket.
Yeah.
That's what I landed on. And I was just like, my jeans were just too tight. I did not have any flexibility. It was not like, I think there's a scene that's similar to that in Wonder Woman, the original Wonder Woman with Gal Gadot. But can you tell me, what were some of what you consider like a best thing that you did, like introducing, Tokyo Gore Police, or maybe a worst where you're just like, the thing is having done the live stuff, I can just point to a lot of things I did that were kind of, I can't believe that.
Yeah.
But we were fortunate in the sense that we could just screw up and just do another take. But
yeah,
you have like a best and a worst of what you would say thinking back, or they're all pretty much a good experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think it all blends together. I was really happy with sort of when we talked about Godzilla. I thought that was interesting because we didn't touch on a lot of like classic stuff so much, just because of the nature of what we were trying to do and show people kind of what's new and what they might not have access to. But that was one of the better segments I felt we did. Worst moments, outside of just my general nervousness, there was one segment where I just completely blanked, or like I wasn't prepared with one of the, because going back to how we set this up, we usually picked 4 and we shot 3. So I was really busy at that time with sort of my day job and my, everything else going on with my life, that I just picked 3 and I didn't have the 4th one on the ready. And then Corrado wanted to cut one of them. So I did not have anything prepared for the 4th one. And I was just like, I remember trying to wing it and it just wasn't working. And I was like, we can't do this, because I just didn't watch the piece. So we ended up going back to the 3 that I originally planned for. But I remember thinking like, oh, this will never happen. And then sure enough, that exact thing happened. And I was just completely unprepared.
Well, if you space on camera, like that happens, that's happened to me live. You just kind of train yourself to like keep talking, you know? Like,
no, that I get. This was literally like, I did not watch one of the movies because of time. And we had 3, but the Grotto was like, oh, let's talk about that 4th one, because I didn't like one of the other ones. And I'm like, oh, sure. And then I was like, I didn't watch it. We can't do it.
Well, they have the copy on the back of the box.
There you go.
But what can you say about the cultural impact? I want to kind of dig into that a little deeper. Like, I mean, because you've been a lifelong nerd. I mean, you work in the industry, you know? I think that's a lot of people's nerds' origin story is you experience all these cool things as a kid and you want to be a part of that. And then you realize, oh, there are a lot of jobs in the industry that you can be a part of it.
Yeah.
So, but have you seen like the culture change? I mean, like, I know that you and I sort of as an elective, and this isn't true of everybody on Attack of the Show, but as an elective, like I was regularly going to Comic-Con. Like my first San Diego Comic-Con was 1989, like, when it was a much smaller event. And then, through the 90s, kind of seeing it sort of slowly build and grow. But perspective, some cultural perspective about the landscape of nerd culture and how it shifted. And especially, I think it's dramatically shifted in the last decade.
Yeah, I think, Attack of the Show and Asian Underground, with it was kind of focused on showing stuff to a broader audience that, people might not have got a chance to see, and allowing a space for people to be able to enjoy that stuff without, shame or any sort of persecution. But I think, as the stuff has gotten more mainstream, there isn't that stigma attached to it, as heavy as it once was. You and I are old enough to where we remember those days where you had to hide your comics and you had to not acknowledge that you played Dungeons and Dragons. And now there's a million streams of celebrity voice actors playing Dungeons and Dragons. So just that sort of acceptance, I think, is the biggest thing. We've gone from something that, people were embarrassed by, or, in some rare cases, people got beat up for, or they, got imposed physical harm for stuff they enjoyed. And while there's, as it's grown and, you get sort of very intense, heated fan debates, for better or worse, I still think it's because it's so mainstream, you're going to have that side of it. But at least now people can be proud of what they love and sort of who they are. And I think Attack of the Show kind of parallels that growth and that sort of the exposure, of going from one comic book movie a year where people are trying really hard not to associate themselves with the look of the comics, where, you have the sort of late 90s, early 2000s versions of that, and then just full on embracing kind of what made those books so great in the first place. And then you have this larger explosion of all things, whether, video game movies are certainly trying to make a comeback. And then with that, you have all of these platforms and avenues for people to talk about this stuff. Before that didn't exist. It was just like forum posts and, people could watch Attack of the Show. And I think I've worked in the animation industry for, over 14 years now. And then I think everywhere I've gone, I always find people who either, they love G4, they watched it intently. Sometimes they'll know my stuff or they'll know us. And then it's always interesting. Like the question I get is like, "Yo, whatever happened to that show?" Like it's literally, every new job I start, once people kind of dig in or if they don't, immediately recognize me, then it's always like, "Oh yeah, whatever happened to G4?" Because those that watched it, like it was part of their lives, and then all of a sudden it was gone.
That's why I'm making this documentary. Whatever happened to Attack of the Show? This is going to answer that question. Whatever happened. It's going to. This will answer the question. So, God, that was really good perspective. I'm glad I asked you again, because I do think there is, like, you can't. Nerd went from being an insult to, if you yelled at someone and called them a nerd, you'd say like, I got this Star Wars T-shirt at Target.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, nerd culture is normal mainstream culture now. You're not a fringe person or a weirdo for reading manga comics or, that stuff's cool. So, I mean, it's, I've lived a lifetime, and most of that lifetime was sort of living in shame of like, well, I'm going to San Diego Comic-Con,
Yeah.
And now that's not a stigma anymore. Like people ask me, how can I get into San Diego Comic-Con? And
we have lived long enough where we've seen Hollywood take over San Diego Comic-Con and then retreat from San Diego Comic-Con only to come back. Right. And like we've gone through that many cycles where it was like, oh, here's all the movies we're going to show. It's too crowded. We don't want to do that. We want to have our own things. And then like, oh, maybe we should have a presence there. So like you and I have, been going long enough to where we've seen all that happen, and going from like back in the days when you could walk through the floor without hitting somebody constantly. And then now it's, hopefully we get back to that soon. But it was just like, just stepping on that floor. And I think it's something everyone should do. If they have access to a convention, if they're watching this, they've probably already gone. But if you haven't and you can get to one, you should get to one just to have that experience once, because it's quite overwhelming, but it's also something to behold.
One of the interesting things in, putting together the research for this is going through old clips from the show and realizing, I don't know if we could. I mean, can you do Attack of the Show today, especially in a time where people are so sensitive about, well, everything? But like, looking at what was done on the show, it was so free form. It was this ongoing conversation. The audience that watched the show was part of the conversation. Can you do a show like that now? Can you do like what Attack of the Show did, thinking back to what it was? Can you do a mainstream show like that now, or has YouTube kind of filled that gap? Where are we? Like, there's just a lot of things I'm watching of clips and going like, if anyone saw me say these things, I would get canceled.
Yeah.
There's cancelable material from everyone based on things that were said in a sort of glib, offhand way on the show, because it was such an atmosphere of, we can talk about anything and do anything. And as long as we're not saying the swear words, we're good.
I think there's two ways to look at this. I think from a sort of the curatorial perspective, it's to do something where you kind of talk off the cuff would be, I think you could do it, but it would be really hard just because all of these properties now are major, attached to major multimedia empires. So it's like there's always going to be some care and caution in dealing with all these properties, just because, you have they have a lot at stake. And then, by that nature, the show would have a lot at stake. I think YouTube does handle a lot of that in terms of, people talking about the content and, providing perspective. And, you have whole channels dedicated to just talking specifically about these kinds of movies. But I do think there's a platform for it, and I think it would just need like a lot of updating, basically, because the sort of what we did back then has evolved so much that it would be hard to go back to the way it was, just for, by what you were saying about things that shouldn't be said. But even taking Asian Underground, for example, like, we did that segment, and, I keep hammering this, but it was like, there was no access to this stuff. You had to go find it. We had to go to, DVD stores or find, distributors and get access to this. But like, if we try to do it now, I don't know what I would be presenting to people as underground, because literally everything is online. So you could go to a streamer, whether it be Netflix or HBO Max, and they have tons of Asian cinema and anime and all this stuff that wasn't available back then very readily. So it wouldn't be as much Asian Underground as it would just be you and I talking about, 4 things we watched on Netflix at this point, because it's so easy to get this stuff. So I think it would be, Attack would be about the people, if we were to do it now, and be, sort of sharing that and engaging with the audience and the culture, because that's what people gravitate towards. And I think, we provided a voice at that time for people who didn't have it. And then now that everyone has it, I think it's a matter of just kind of sharing that, that space with everyone.
That's really well said. That has to be the smartest answer I've heard so far. That's good. What? Let's talk about the show getting canceled. I don't know if we stopped doing, and don't answer yet. I want to, but like, when you stopped doing Asian Underground, or when you heard, hey, the show is being canceled, it's over, we're banking some shows. I mean, it's my recollection is just there was a lot of turmoil in my personal life during that time. So I was dealing with personal life turmoil. I was going through a bad relationship breakup. And then the job that I had for almost 8 years was ending. What is your recollection about how you heard the information that it was canceled, when it was officially announced, and how you experienced that?
This is kind of a funny story for me, is because I actually got a raise the year the show was going to get canceled. So I got a raise. I think we did 2 more shoots. And then I think Corrado was the one that told me what was going down as far as like, the show is ending. At that point, I think I had reached a point where I was comfortable, not doing the segment anymore. It was a bummer to see, like, because I think I heard the network sale first, and then what they were keeping. And then it just seemed like, oh, this is actually going to go away. As I remember, I know that the format had changed at one point. I think we were shooting less because there wasn't a need for this stuff as much. So, but I do remember we did a couple segments, and I remember thinking on the last one, without actually saying, I'm like, oh, this might be the last time I'm doing this, but we'll see. And then sure enough, it was the last time we did it, which is a bummer, because we didn't have that sort of like acknowledgement or knowing that it was going to be the last one. So we couldn't like celebrate it in any kind of way. And I don't, because I wasn't a full-time part of the show, I didn't experience what that was like. And it was probably better for me anyways, not to have to go through that. But for me, it was a little bit unceremonious, and then, but I was also at peace with it, strangely enough.
Wow. It was a bummer. There's,
yeah.
It's funny that you thought that you just sort of had, like, in a way, kind of a premonition.
Yeah. I don't know what it was. I think like you guys, or the vibe I got was that everyone was kind of like working really hard, because, whenever there's a massive change, like, there's uncertainty, and then we don't know how to go about stuff. So I remember we shot one, and then on the last one that we shot, I remember thinking like, oh, I think things were starting to scale back. I remember hearing stuff about that, and I was just like, I don't know if there's no like assurances that we want to keep going. And I remember thinking like, oh, we didn't have a plan for another one. And we usually did. We're like, oh, we'll meet in a month. We'll shoot a couple more. But it was just like, yeah, we'll find out and then we'll bank some more. It was kind of that, like, because nobody knew. And then, or, if they did, they weren't saying, which is fine. But also it's like, oh man, like it felt weird. And I could only imagine what it felt like in the office, because it just seemed like, it seemed like the writing was on the wall before anybody told anybody anything.
Yeah.
And that's always a bummer in any industry, in any job. Like, you never want to have to go through that.
I did feel that. For me, I kind of felt like the show ended when Kevin left. Like, that was it. When Olivia left and it was just Kevin, it's like, okay, that kind of like that spark that they had just wasn't present. And then when Kevin left, I thought, well, that's, it didn't last much longer after. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think lightning can strike twice? Can the magic of what G4 and Attack of the Show represented, can that come back? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think it can. I alluded to this a little bit in a previous question, but I don't think it can, just because everything has changed and there's so much of this out there. I think to sort of be the central hub of everything isn't going to work as much, because everyone has so many options. But I do think, given the platform to just kind of celebrate this stuff with people, could work, because that's what drove it in the first place. I think what we're seeing now is everyone is so specialized within their own sort of versions of it. So you'll have like, a production that's very specific to the content that they're talking about, whether it be Marvel or Disney or excuse me, or DC Warner. So they kind of done their own versions of it just for their own content. So I think having sort of just an overall view from somebody outside of those realms would help, and I think could work. It just would take a lot of updating based on how we used to do things back then. But I also think it could be smaller. Like, it doesn't have to be sort of an everyday thing, and maybe it's a weekly thing where the things are more specialized. You could do longer segments instead of doing really short ones. I think there's room to play, and I think this is a weird analogy, but using something like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, it's like how he covers a week's worth of news, but he only focuses on two very specific segments. And I think that sort of in-depth look at things is a lot more informational and a lot more it celebrates the content more, I think, if you can get more specific. So I think because there's so much of it out there and there's so many people covering this stuff, the more in depth you can go and the longer you can get the material to work, I think functions better than sort of that, early 2000s, late 90s, like really fast cutty stuff. So if like we were to do Asian Underground again, I would just do the whole segment on one piece, or divide it up into two 15-minute chunks talking about two movies from one director. And I think that stuff plays a lot better now, because people are very interested in sort of the mechanics behind all this. It's not just like, show me this thing and then I'll go buy it. It's literally like, oh, I want to talk to you about it, and I want to know, everything there is to know about it. And I think the in-depth stuff always works a little bit better now. This is my personal take, but I do think there's a way for it to be done. It would just be a lot different from what it used to be.
You hit the nail on the head. Without the restrictions of a network and sort of traditional television, you could go in depth. That was my frustration always in doing DVD Tuesday. It's like they would come up to me and they would give me a time count of how much time I had before I did the segment. They're like, oh, some things happened. We have to cut your segment now to 4 minutes and 30 seconds. And I had to just keep a little clock in my head going, like, I have 4 movies to cover. I can talk about each of them for 40 seconds.
Yeah, it was weird because, Asian Underground existed as a chunk to put in if something ran short. And it was like, oh, we can block Asian Underground in here because we have this 4 minutes bank. 4 minutes, which took, 2.5 hours to shoot, and clearly had an hour of yours and my conversations about this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think, the evolution of it would be to be more in depth and to be more knowledgeable and to do more research on the project, so you're not constantly trying to fill these little chunks. I think, if if it were to come back, it would be more of a war and less of an attack, because you would have these like long drawn plans to kind of focus on this stuff. And I think that stuff works really well now. I know when I watch content, I often find that if it's something I want to learn about, I like these sort of in-depth pieces, and I like when stuff, allows itself to breathe. And I think, the one thing about as great as the experience was, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, I always felt you and I never had enough time to talk about the stuff, because we were always like getting through the topics and getting on point. And even what we did, which was a truncated version of what we would normally talk about, was then truncated more so it could fit sort of in the on-air time slot.
Yeah, I do think that things like YouTube and podcasting and whatnot has really shown that when you take a deep dive, I mean, look, a 4-minute segment on a bunch of movies, that's good. Give me the quick information, in, out, whatever, the tweet version. But I think that there is a desire, maybe this is because of my age, but I prefer like the longer, deeper dive into something. So I just don't know how that plays on a mainstream level these days. Now, first of all, Jeff Wong, I can't thank you enough for doing this, but I have to ask, is there anything I didn't ask about your experience that you want to make sure people know? You mentioned that you worked at Fox when Olivia was there.
I mean, we worked in the same building. I don't think I spoke to her more than a couple of times, but I did notice like, oh, she went off to become something big, which was kind of awesome, seeing like somebody you see in the halls to see success that way. No, I think, my experience with Asian Underground was like 99% shared with you. So I, outside of the, couple prep stuff I had to do with, Corrado or Kyle, as it were, our other producer, I think we, it's tied in my head to you. So I think, it will always be remembered. And like I said, more people recognize me when we're standing like this, because that framing is what people remember. So I think, there was very little outside of our shared experiences that I could talk about with Asian Underground. It was a pleasure. And, I couldn't thank the show or you enough for that opportunity, because it was something that I thought I would have never done. And even when I kind of look back on it, it's very surreal to me. And then it's a fun story to be like, oh yeah, I was on TV once, like, and then to be able to remember all that stuff and how it went down. And I often sometimes think about like, oh, what would I do now if I were to do it again? And I think it's what I said earlier, is like doing something longer format and where it's more of a conversation, but I'd rather have you there than not. So,
all right. Well, here's the thing. It looks like we're going to have an Attack of the Doc panel at LA Comic-Con, December 3rd through the 5th, 2021. We're going to be doing that. And awesome. You should be on the panel. And then we should do a different panel. And we should basically just do an Asian cinema panel.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would love to do that.
And we should get other people to be on the panel. It could be like sponsored by Film Thread or something. Like, let's just do a panel. Let's just do a panel at a convention. And if a lot of people show up and it's fun, we'll just do that at conventions.
Yeah, I'm down for that.
Okay, good. Because we're in the same city, so that works out.
Yeah. No, LA Comic-Con sounds great because it's right here. So.
It's right here. And things should be open up by then. I mean, there's
absolutely.
I know we're doing masks off soon, but we're going to get to the point where large gatherings, it's going to be cool. So yeah, let's plan on it then.
Yeah, keep me posted on that for sure.
I'll let you know. Okay, I'm going to end the broadcast.